oil, so when we exported oil to the United States, the federal government took a huge portion of that they weren't entitled to. So there's that big conflict in the 1970s. Now, Premier Peter Lougheed fought hard against Pierre Trudeau. One of the things Peter Lougheed also did was he created a Citizens Advisory Committee on the Constitution to make recommendations to the provincial government. So this committee, one of the members of that committee was a University of Calgary law professor named Gene Deas. Deas convinced the committee that the way that we could get better representation within the national government is to change the Senate so that it would be an elected body with an equal number for each province. So it was this professor in the 1970s who proposed this idea and got the idea going. So in 1981, the Canada West Foundation published a book-length proposal for the Triple Senate. It was authored by Senator Ernest Manning and a couple other prominent people. Senator Ernest Manning, of course, he'd been Premier of Alberta from 1940s to 1960s. He was Alberta's longest serving Premier, and he became a senator afterwards. He helped to write this report proposing the Triple Senate in 1981. And in 1983, an Alberta Committee for an Elected Senate was formed, and it was headed by Bert Brown, who was a farmer from Catherine. And in 1984, the Alberta government, or the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta, which was, of course, the provincial governing party, in 1984, the convention of that party endorsed the Triple Senate as their official proposal for Canada. Then the following year, the Alberta government had a special select committee on Senate reform in the legislature, and that committee also created a report in 1985 that recommended the Triple Senate. So that report is actually online. There's a scanned copy online. It's almost 300 pages long. I just printed off the cover page and also the overview, which gives their conclusion. And this is the conclusion. This is an Alberta Legislature Committee conclusion. The Alberta Select Committee on Upper House Reform recommends a Senate for Canada that is directly elected by the people, with each province represented by an equal number of senators. Senators should have powers which allow them to be effective in providing the regional voice envisioned by the Fathers of Confederation. So we have the governing party endorsing the Triple Senate. We have a legislature committee endorsing the Triple Senate. And Don Getty, when he became Premier later in 1985, he officially committed the Alberta government to supporting the Triple Senate. Then he created a Senate Reform Task Force to promote the Triple Senate idea across Canada. So they kind of had ambassadors across Canada. So you had the Alberta government promoting the Triple Senate right across Canada to get support for it. Then you might remember in October 1989, Don Getty held Canada's first Senate election. It was just here in Alberta. The winner of that Senate election was Stan Waters, who was then appointed to the Senate. You know, as you understand right now, the Prime Minister of Canada, he can select whoever he wants. If he needs a senator for a particular province, he can select whoever he wants. But the idea with these Senate elections was that the people would have a voice in contributing to who those senators would be. So that the people would elect a certain number of people, or the people of the province, the voters would select certain people and their names would be submitted to the Prime Minister to be as candidates for the Senate, rather than just the Prime Minister selecting whoever he wanted, which were usually people who helped him in his party. So we had that Senate election with Stan Waters getting appointed to the Senate. And in 1983, the Reform Party of Canada, of course, won 52 seats in the federal election. So it looked like Senate reform was on a roll. We had the Alberta government supporting it, promoting it. We had the Senate election, the Reform Party got all these MPs. So things were going, but the Senate reform never did take off because Central Canada didn't support it. But there was one more shot at Senate reform after that, and that was with Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper, one of the original Reform Party MPs, one of the founders of that party. Then the Reform Party, of course, converted itself into the Canadian Alliance, and Stephen Harper became leader of that party in 2002. Then he led the Canadian Alliance into a merger with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada in 2003. And then 3 years later, Harper was elected as Prime Minister of Canada. You know, he still had these many pro-Western ideas, the pro-Senate reform ideas. So when he became Prime Minister in 2006, he actually actively and very aggressively pursued Senate reform from the position that he had. And he was the Prime Minister, the top political official in Canada, and he tried to get Canada to adopt certain forms of Senate reform. And so in May of 2006, they proposed a bill within the Senate itself for Senate reform, and Prime Minister Harper testified before the Senate committee that was considering that proposed bill. Now this is very unusual. It's very unusual for a Prime Minister to testify to a Senate committee on a bill, but Stephen Harper was so committed to it that he did that. That just showed how much commitment he had for that. Now later that year, they also introduced the bill into the House of Commons, for Senate reform that would have authorized consultative elections, which was basically what they did in Alberta. Each province then, if that bill had gone through, each province would hold an election that would offer, the winners of that election would be offered to the Prime Minister that he could select them for the Senate rather than the Prime Minister just choosing whoever he wanted to. It was a way of having democratic participation in choosing senators in Canada. Now those two bills that I mentioned, they both died. Harper continued to introduce more and more bills. He ended up, over the first 7 years of his term in office, he introduced 3 Senate reform bills into the Senate and 5 into the House of Commons. And Alberta continued to have those consultative elections. So we had consultative elections for the Senate in 1998 and 2004. And one of the winners of those 2 elections was Burt Brown, who had been chairman of the Canadian Committee on the Tripoli Senate. So this kind of the primary leader, the primary activist for Senate reform, he himself was appointed to the Senate. So Harper was trying to get the Senate reform through the powers that he had. But then Quebec was very much opposed to the reforms that Harper was trying to achieve. And so in 2012, the Quebec government initiated a reference case to the Quebec Court of Appeal, like challenging Harper's laws, basically asking that Supreme Court to rule on the constitutional status of the proposals that Stephen Harper was making. Now, in response to what Quebec did, Stephen Harper initiated a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada. Basically, Harper was trying to preemptively get a higher ruling than the Quebec ruling. Stephen Harper wanted to be the one asking the questions of the court rather than Quebec asking, because if he asked the questions, he'd be more likely to get the kind of answers that he wanted. So he sent out a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada, which ruled in 2014 basically that the proposals he was making were unconstitutional. The only way to get any kind of Senate reform in Canada would be through a formal constitutional amendment. So that essentially killed Senate reform in Canada. So we have to look at what this whole situation reveals to us. Here you have a man who is very, very committed to Senate reform, the highest political office in Canada. He was initiating these bills and so on, but he was thwarted every step of the way in trying to reform the Senate to make things better for Western Canada. That he was thwarted, of course, by the opposition parties. He was thwarted by members of the Senate itself. He was even thwarted by some people within his own caucus, right? Because Stephen Harper had many members of his caucus, both from Central Canada. They didn't want Senate reform. And ultimately, he was thwarted also by some of the provincial premiers and Supreme Court of Canada. So here you have a Prime Minister of Canada who is intensely committed to Senate reform for Canada, but he could not prevail in the face of the opposition that he faced. So if Stephen Harper couldn't do it, if Stephen Harper couldn't reform Canada's constitution to make it more amenable to the West, then it can't be done. If the Prime Minister can't make the changes that we want, then it can't be done. Albertans must realize that we sent very good people to Ottawa to try and reform Canada's constitution to make things better for us, and it didn't work. And it wasn't just Senate reform either. I mean, Stephen Harper, from a Western and Canadian and conservative perspective, he was not able to achieve a lot of the things that people wanted, and that's because, again, as I mentioned before, for any federal government to be empowered, it has to have the support of Central Canada. It has to have most of its members of Parliament from Central Canada, and so it always has to cater to Central Canada. And this, Stephen Harper even had to face that himself. And so that was kind of limited what he was able to achieve from a Western and a conservative perspective. There's just no way out of this. This is the Canadian system. So when you have a Prime Minister as sympathetic to the West as Stephen Harper was, you can't break away from the Central Canadian dominance. It's clear that achieving independence is the only reasonable option left for Alberta to pursue freedom and prosperity. Now, regardless of whether it's a conservative or liberal in power, Alberta always contributes billions of dollars every year more to Canada than it gets in return. Alberta contributes billions more every year, and Quebec receives billions more every year. And it doesn't matter if it's liberals or conservatives in power. Quebec benefits disproportionately from the equalization program as compared to other provinces. Of course, the equalization program was created in 1957, and in 1982, Pierre Trudeau put it into the Constitution. So it didn't become a part of the Constitution until Pierre Trudeau made his changes in 1982. And all the major parties in Canada, all the major federal parties support equalization. And that's because if they don't, they'll be shut out of Quebec. Because Quebec benefits so much from equalization, the only way a party can win seats in Quebec is by supporting equalization. And of course, this affected Stephen Harper as well. Like when Paul Martin was Prime Minister before Stephen Harper, he created a panel that would review the equalization program. And that panel issued its report after Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, and it recommended a formula that would give more money to Quebec. And Stephen Harper accepted that formula so that more money would be given to Quebec. So here's a pro-Western Prime Minister who's accepting an equalization formula to give more money to Quebec. And why would he do that? Because he needed seats in Quebec to stay in power. He wanted to win seats in Quebec as well. So any political party that wants to form the government in power has to support equalization, or else they won't be able to win the election. Of course, we realize that, equalization program is very unpopular out west because we know that that's what the equalization program is for. I mean, one of the reasons it's for federal politicians to be able to buy votes in Quebec for themselves so that they can win power, and it's also to keep Quebec within Canada. I mean, one of the main arguments in Quebec for remaining within Canada rather than separating is because of the billions of dollars they get every year. And this is, sometimes this is an explicit argument there, that if we separate from Canada, Quebec's saying this, if Quebec separates from Canada, if we leave this way, then we'll lose all those billions a year. And so there are people in Quebec who support remaining in Canada because that's where their money comes from. They would lose that money if they left Canada, right? So we have to realize that because none of the major parties are opposed to the equalization program, because they all support the equalization program, Alberta will always be paying more into it, and Alberta will be paying more, and Quebec will be receiving more, because any party that opposed that situation would not be able to win power. So just to come to the end here, so the point is that over the last several decades, a number of very credible alternatives for Alberta have failed. Electing Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives in 1984 did not solve Alberta's problems with the Confederation. Electing substantial numbers of Reform Party MPs in the 1990s did not solve Alberta's problems with the Confederation. Electing Stephen Harper's Conservatives from 2006 to 2015 did not solve Alberta's problems with the Confederation, otherwise we wouldn't be in the situation we face today. Trying to get a Triple E Senate was unsuccessful despite the open support of the Alberta government, the Reform Party of Canada, and Prime Minister Stephen Harper. What more could anybody have done? What more could we have done than all the efforts we've tried over these years to make things better for Alberta? Clearly, all of these efforts show that we can't solve our problems within Canada. Yet even today, there are people who are saying that all we have to do is elect Pierre Poilievre and he'll solve our problems, or all we have to do is, make a change in the Constitution. But history shows that electing Pierre Poilievre will not solve our problems, and there aren't going to be any constitutional changes that are going to benefit Alberta. Only independence can solve the problem by putting Albertans in control of our own destiny. A referendum on independence is the necessary step to ensure a prosperous and free future. Now, 50 years ago in 1974, Pierre Trudeau's government introduced a budget which maintained some of the new anti-Alberta tax policies they introduced, especially the export tax on oil. Now, the export tax on oil was unprecedented in Canadian history, and Premier Peter Lougheed called it the biggest ripoff of any province that's ever occurred in Confederation's history. Now, in response to that budget in 1974, Don Getty, who was then Alberta's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, he urged Albertans to, quote, fight an outright battle for the future. Maybe we will lose. Maybe they can confiscate our dreams and our future. But if they do, let's make sure it's only after we have fought them every inch of the way. Now, that was 50 years ago. Now it's 50 years later, and it's more important than ever that we fight them every inch of the way, and we can win if Alberta becomes independent. Thank you.